Hi, everybody. Hi. It's a very excited crowd today. Okay. Today, I'm introducing a real speaker, Sunil Kadri. Sunil joined CDU as a professor of aquaculture, I think back in March. He's from New Zealand, but much of his career has been focused elsewhere in the world. He has ties to both universities and commercial ventures on at least 3 continents, maybe 4 continents. And today he'll be telling us about movements in aquaculture toward improving fish welfare. And a reminder that we'll have food outside afterwards.
All right, thanks very much. I only found out this afternoon that there would be no presenter screen just here. It's a bit daunting, so in a panic, I printed out my talk. Couple of things to say about this slide before we get into it. The template, the last time I presented a version of this, it was to industry and it was on this template, and because of the way the headings are and stuff, it was going to be too much work to change that. So it's a very weak excuse. So I'm not trying to sell you consultancy services, I promise. And I have put Real's logo in pride of place above the other ones, but I thought I'd put those in there. It's quite logo-tastic, just because I thought it would serve as an introduction to what I get up to. So before I came to Darwin, I was based in Patagonia, and I have, as a sort of leftover ongoing, I guess, nightlife occasionally, of occasion, through my consultancy company, Aquaculture Innovation, I still serve these 2 companies. And I wanted to mention them here because what's a common interest to them and myself is fish welfare. Blue Grove is a technology company, tech startup that uses hydroacoustics to monitor fish behaviour and use that for various operational tools. And STEM provides fish health and biotech to the fish farm industry. In both cases, they're small Norwegian multinationals serving the salmon industry. Salmon industry is where I was working before here, as well as salmon research. So there's a lot of salmon stuff I'm going to present today. It's well funded, the research, because it's a valuable species. So it's a good illustration. It won't all be salmon, but hopefully, since you don't always see salmon work presented, you'll find it interesting. All right. So I can't make it go like that. So what I want to present is, positive and negative welfare. Oh, sorry, I forgot one more thing. There's a question mark there in the title. When I was asked to check the stuff that was going out, I didn't check the title, and that question mark's vital. If anyone's come here to get answers, you can leave now, because I've come here to present a question. All right. So what I want to present is positive and negative welfare. What are they? Negative welfare in modern aquaculture, studying emotions in fish. This is part of positive welfare. How to recognize what feels good for a fish. Care of body surfaces as a positive experience for fish. And then how do we put that into application for aquaculture? So firstly, how welfare is defined. Now, this could be a whole talk in itself, which I've got ready to go, but I don't know how often you're going to let me get up here and how often you want to hear my voice. So I thought I should just go straight to something I'm really interested in, rather than a talk on the background. If anyone wants that in the future, or a private welfare definitions talk, it's ready to go. But look, the question of animal welfare raises some complex issues around how to define good welfare, and especially in fish. There's controversies in fish, and questions around, or controversy around, whether they're sufficiently sentient for welfare to be a relevant question. I'm skipping past all of that. But as I say, in the future we can do it. But I'm now going to give you 3 categories that broadly encompass most definitions of welfare. One is the proper functioning of biological systems. This is how welfare has generally been studied historically, researched, as well as how it's been looked at from an industry perspective. It's where knowledge and industry practice have pulled together to ensure good welfare for fish. And if you're using that sort of definition, there's no need to discuss emotions or positive welfare. This is just about, is the fish healthy? Can it eat? Is it growing? Those sorts of, is the physiology working, etc. But then we get to the ability to perform a natural behavioural repertoire as would occur in nature. And this, it may sound simple, but it actually brings up a lot of controversial topics or complex topics over which there's a lot of controversy and uncertainty. And it means we can't make any unambiguous statements in this area. And it does inevitably relate to emotions, positive and possibly negative, and behavioural need. And that brings us to the next point, which is feelings. Okay, freedom from emotions and access to positive emotions. Now, again, controversial whether fish can feel emotions, positive and negative, but what we do know is that they certainly show aversion to harmful stimuli and simulated harmful stimuli that are those reactions. They show orders of magnitude greater than any kind of reflex that some people have argued is all that fish show. But the issue of positive emotions is much less studied, but it's obviously an area that be a very useful field of research and will allow us to get fish to actually show us how to improve their welfare. So positive welfare, what is it? Look, as you can see, one definition that I've picked out, there's quite a few out there, mental and physical states that exceed what's necessary for immediate survival. So it's a fuzzy definition. Does removal of a negative experience equal positive welfare? I would suggest to you from the human psychology insight, a life without positive experiences is not merely a neutral life, it's a bad life. And also from recent experience with the pandemic and lockdowns, that we should know very well that just getting rid of negative things from your life is not does not make for a good life. And so what they're trying to deal with these definitions, though, is getting at things like boredom. You know, are the fish getting bored? And positive welfare has received relatively little attention until recently when it comes to fish. Cook and Franks published this paper in 2019, which was a sort of a landmark by creating a framework for which we could look at this. And I'll come back to that. I'll come back to that paper in a couple of slides. In the meantime, just in terms of thinking about what is positive welfare, we all know what it looks like for dogs. Jimmy, who gave me these photos, he lives in Scotland. That's out his backyard, so that's why there's lots of snow there. But you know, we see that day to day, that difference. Beth, I don't want to be seen to be standing on her toes, so if you want to speak to the slide. So with cattle, and so in a farming environment, you can see that the difference there, there's obviously tactile stimulation, ability to scratch your back, but the place is clean. The cattle are clearly better fed, so they've got a much better life there. And then you have something like this, which is I guess the sort of gold standard as it gets for a cow. If there's plenty to eat and there's scratching posts out there as well, then life's pretty good, except that you have to be separated from your calf rather quickly at some stage, which can't be very positive at all. And we don't hear about that much, do we, in cow welfare?
But they're now doing stuff for the cows. Anyway, carry on.
Okay. Now, negative welfare in modern aquaculture. So negative welfare is what we always called welfare. It's like getting rid of things that are bad experiences for the fish. And that's been the most pressing concern to date for farm fish and other animals, and quite rightly so, because it's been to minimize pain and suffering. So in broad terms, in defining welfare as the proper functioning of biological systems, good farmers and welfare scientists know and have known how to monitor welfare, where the main welfare problems lie, and how to promote welfare. So there's always been this culture of improvement. So in general, aquaculture's paid due attention to welfare, with good welfare leading to good production, especially since the animals that we're farming are so close to wild. I mean, salmon have been farmed for 30 years, but they're only 5 generations from the wild or so. So they've been much more sensitive to environmental challenge than animals that have been bred for many, many years. But inevitably, commodification, industrialization, and consolidation has the potential to take things in the wrong direction welfare-wise. And we've seen that, we're starting to see production-related diseases arrive in aquaculture, at least in the salmon farming industry. I don't think there's anyone in the salmon farming industry listening. So positive welfare and emotions in fish. Coming back to the Five Cook and Frank's talk I was mentioning earlier, here's just the framework that they had slightly reworded. So there's 3 concepts of value effectiveness, control effectiveness, and truth effectiveness. And the interpretation of those is the value effectiveness is the motivation to gain resources, mostly food, of course, maybe access to mates, but usually in aquaculture, the animals are not reproductive, and to avoid injury. Control effectiveness is about being in control, so being able to swim freely where they want, how they want. And truth effectiveness is about motivation to learn and reduce uncertainty about the environment. And that's actually really important and underestimated, like knowing what's going on and what's there, and not being afraid of, and to quote Donald Rumsfeld, unknown, but a known unknown. So value effectiveness relates to positive and negative welfare, obviously, because we're talking about food and injury. But the other two are very much about positive welfare, about feelings. So really, we have to talk about what fish like. And that doesn't have to depend on anthropomorphic and hand-waving assertions. There's actually ways of probing that objectively. I'm going to show you a couple of examples. So this is one example. Anyone here work on convid cichlids? No, good. So these fish, they have long-term monogamous bonds that have been really well studied, pair bonds, well studied, careful mate choice by the females, right down to genetic compatibility, and the females tend to, who get to have access to the males that they prefer, have better reproductive success. So there's a fitness component to getting the right male, as it were. And so what I'm going to show you now is, the next slide's kind of complicated. It's a cognitive bias test. Don't worry if you don't know what that is, because I'm going to show you. Is done. Then there's a mate preference test. I'll step away. All right. Then there's a mate preference test. So the female's in the middle and there's males on either side, and she indicates which one she likes. And then they're paired with either the preferred or the non-preferred male. And then there's another cognitive bias test. Okay. Right. So as I say, this slide's a little complicated with lots of clicks. So there's a training phase where the fish are trained to, they have a tank, so this is a tank, and they have two jars, one at each end, and one's black, one's white, and they change that color for different females. So they didn't all get the same combinations, so that color wouldn't be the bias. And basically, if they got the positive jar meant the jar with food in it. The negative jar is an empty jar. And they very quickly learn that which the positive jar is, and they just keep going to it. And if they only, oops, how did that happen? And if they, maybe I can minus it now. And if they get the negative jar, they just mooch around. Maybe try it at some stage. And then what happens is the researchers then put a gray jar, so something right in the middle, without the other two jars. And so the fish are faced with that, and they have to, and then it's observed what they do. And so if they treat this ambiguous cue like the rewarded cue, in other words, if they go straight to it, then that's considered to be a positive effect. They're optimistic. So it's, you know, one's propensity to experience positive emotions and interact with others and with life's challenges in a positive way. So that's just going straight to it. If they treat it like an unrewarded cue, that's negative effect and pessimistic. So, you know, if they just mooch around, that's a negative effect. So then it tends to indicate negative emotions, being negativity in relationships and surroundings. So that's how cognitive bias tests work. We've done a lot in mammals. So with cognitive bias test 1, so at the beginning, they all learned very quickly. They all trained up very well, and they all went straight for the ambiguous cue in a positive manner. So they're all feeling very optimistic about life. And then they were paired either with a preferred male or a non-preferred male. And then the test was done again. And the females paired with the preferred male retained their optimistic bias. Can you tell what's going to come next? And yes, I'm afraid that the females paired with their non-preferred males became pessimistic. So that was, you know, that was just a way to illustrate that that these tests, which are done on mammals to demonstrate emotions, as they're referred to in these studies, work on fishes. Okay, so they tell us that fish can experience these states. So that's the only reason I wanted to show you that. It's not, obviously we can't just do this in aquaculture. And I hope that wasn't too close to the bone for anyone. Not much help in considering positive welfare on working fish farms. So let's look at a more pragmatic approach. What behavioral science would indicate that a fish does something because it feels good? And the kind of thing we look at is, you know, they spend a lot of time doing it, often at the expense of feeding. This isn't just for fish, by the way. They'll work hard for the opportunity to do it. The opportunity to do it reinforces learning, and doing it lowers stress. An example from an animal you'll know, chooks. So birds, it happens for them with dust bathing. So there's a reason to think that care of body services is a driver for positive emotional rewards. So in fish, you know, well-maintained scales and mucus are critical for fish health, so maybe the same applies here. And now I'm going to give you an illustrative example of that. Does anyone here work on, or has anyone ever worked on cleaner wrasse? Good, good. I can say what I like. Uh-oh. Cleaner wrasse, yeah. So look, cleaner wrasse, they famously remove ectoparasites from larger fish, the clients, and they've been quite well studied in terms of their behavior. The individual cleaners stay in one place. They've got fixed cleaning stations, and the fish of various species come from far and wide to get cleaned up. A bit like you might see on a cartoon, it all really happens down there on the reef. There's some very complex behavior exchanges, and the cleaners actually prefer scales and mucus to the lice that they're cleaning off. So they sometimes bite and make the clients jump. And for regular clients of theirs, this is often followed by what can only be described as a back massage. They give them a wee rub, and those clients remain regular. So there's a lot of work on the cleaners, but the clients are also very interesting. So these are the ones benefiting, and you know, they visit the cleaning stations frequently. They'll travel long distances to do it. They've got preferred cleaning stations, and they locate them using mental maps, and they learn to avoid cleaners that have bitten them, and they also avoid cleaners that they see biting others. And so the cleaners are very clever. They're actually, sometimes they arrange themselves so they take a bite out of a client when no others can see, because they get themselves in a position to do that. So, you know, these aren't just dumb animals with 3-second memories. Is really the point I'm trying to make here. But so client species on reefs from which cleaners have been removed have higher baseline cortisol levels, and so stronger acute stress responses. And they will learn in the lab a spatial discrimination task to get a simulated back massage, which reduces stress levels. So all of these things basically fulfill the criteria that I just gave you with regard to what is positive welfare. You know, what could we classify as positive welfare? And so how could we do something like that on farms, taking care of skin? So care of body surfaces on farms, it could be done through scratching posts of some kind. And I'll come back to this a bit later, but you know, brushing surfaces have been tried, bubbles, or localized current to keep their skin in good condition, and always looking for opportunities for improving husbandry. If you could get fish to be attracted to come to a particular place, you could also potentially use it as a site for husbandry measures or inspections. Now, what I want to come back to, though, before we go back to the skin, is just other ways in which we can potentially promote positive welfare. For fish, or for any animals, but in general, when there's a risk, when there's a perceived risk, reducing uncertainty is hugely motivating, hugely motivating. So frightened sticklebacks, these little fish, will actually swim up towards a huge pike, a predator, just to know that it's there, and then swim away, just because, you know, they're just to reduce that uncertainty. So how can we offer something like that in aquaculture? That's, you know, being in control. So control effectiveness, self-feeding systems. This is a system, this is actually from Blue Grove. This is a system where the fish swim up into where the hydroacoustic beam is, and that switches on the feed. So that gives them control over feeding. But when it comes to the truth and learning and reducing uncertainty about the environment, landmarks are a potential area to provide in farms to reduce uncertainty, so they know where they are, can orient themselves and create a mental map. Now, that's all your sort of background, because all of these things are called environmental enrichment. So now everything I'm going to talk about is environmental enrichment as a means by which to potentially deliver positive welfare to fish and farms. So Pablo in Mallorca, you could visit him later in the year if you want, did a great review a couple of years ago, and that was one of the definitions he provided, and he talked about how it's all-encompassing. That's the paper there, and there's several different areas of environmental enrichment that he broke the field up into. I'm going to be focusing mostly on the physical. I will touch on the dietary as well. And what is it? So your standard aquaculture tank is homogeneous environment with some pellets that are going in, so there's always enough food, and that's the natural environment. So it's bringing some of these stimulus basically into the aquaculture environment, which as you can imagine, cause concern for your average fish farmer. And this was a paper from 2013, just to show how effective this can be. So they, Anna Grow and Victoria, got a standard fish tank, put a few rocks in the bottom, and cut up some bin bags and made these artificial weeds, and compared that with fish just in homogeneous tanks. And the results were remarkable. I mean, improved brain development, better learning, and also they had much, much better anti-predator responses. So you can imagine the Pacific Northwest, where they release 1.4 billion fish into the sea every year using aquaculture to keep the salmon fishery going. And they don't do this. How many of those fish die needlessly because they don't get the stimulus? I mean, it's all part of ontogeny. But as I say, aquaculture naturally has concerns, and the ones that I think, you know, I'm putting words in their mouth, but the ones that are tend to be of concern are sanitary risks, reduced space for stocking, added costs, and more equipment in the water. So, you know, to address the first one, the systems need to be cleaned, they need to be cleanable, or they need to be self-cleaning, self-maintaining. With regard to stocking density, there's lots of space under current stocking densities in most species. Like, we hear about stocking densities in salmon in the press. They're actually, in your salmon cage, has got somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000 fish in the cage. Only 2% of that volume is taken up by salmon, and the rest is water. So there is some room. My point is not to get into stocking densities, but there is some room for some other bits and pieces. I'll come back to cost and equipment in the water later, because actually environmental enrichment has historically been done by the industry. So these are salmon alevins, for those of you who don't know. So when salmon hatch out, there's an egg, they hatch out, and then they're in the gravel, and they don't need any food because they've got all the food from that egg sac, yolk sac, and they sit there in the gravel, and that's their life until they use up the yolk sac and turn into little fish and go up and start feeding on drift. But how do you grow an animal like that has that sort of need? So aquaculture has years and years ago, in the 70s or so, developed these mats, and they still use them today. Very low tech, but that is environmental enrichment. And these are all scientific publications have shown all these benefits of using these mats. So the industry is already doing this stuff where there's a benefit. That said, when it comes to salmon, as I said, I'd talk about them a bit. there's this question about, okay, so if environmental enrichment is about stimulating the natural environment, and these salmon, once they're at sea, are swimming across the ocean to a feeding ground, is it even relevant? And, you know, how could we even possibly know that the fish are benefiting? And now I want to show you some evidence, anecdotal, not scientific, that they do actually benefit from some change in the environment. Now, this is looking down onto a salmon cage, and around the outside, there's this net, curtain. And they put these curtains down, going down about 20 meters around the cage to stop sea lice getting in, because the sea lice don't go down below that. So that's what that is. It's a sea lice curtain. And obviously you're going to have water quality problems if you have that curtain there, because the water is supposed to come in. So these sort of aeration systems are put at the bottom, and they draw water up from below into the cage. So there's lots of bubbles in the cage. Remember we were talking about bubbles earlier. So these are my colleagues selling the low-tech stuff in Blue Grove. So I said to them one day, you know, what do the salmon do? What do the salmon do when you've got these bubbles on? And would you know it? Oh, that's the wrong one. Sorry. There. So those are fish swimming in the bubble stream. And as you can see, they're working to be in there. They're actually choosing to be in there. And then this is outside the bubble stream. And really all I wanted to show you there was that most of them are actually in there. Now, what I know from talking to my colleagues is that they don't spend all of their time in there. But they do it together. So they're going in and out of that bubble stream. As I say, it's anecdotal. How do I get beyond this? There we go. So there's some questions to ask, you know, is it positive welfare environmental enrichment? And are they going for better water quality? Are they just going in there when the water quality gets bad? Are they going for a bubble massage? Are they just enjoying the currents, swimming in the currents? Is it a game or is it play? So that needs some focused research. And I'll be coming to another video with similar questions. Going back to what I said earlier, I mean, this is just a repeat, so you haven't forgotten, landmarks, providing landmarks. I want to show you one more video. This is inside a salmon cage, okay? So this curtain is artificial algae, it's plastic, and it's a habitat for these cleaner fish. See them? They eat the salmon, the lice off the salmon. And as we look through to the other side of the curtain, you can see what salmon normally do in a cage. See them swimming around there outside the curtain? But if you look down the bottom, look at those salmon. Now they're doing stuff that we had never seen salmon do in a cage before. They're kind of exploring, they're all looking around. If you try to get salmon to swim through a tunnel, they'll never go there, but put this in, don't ask them to do anything, and there they are. Slowing down, looking around. There's one just fancying leaving the curtain now. So this, again, it's anecdotal, there's no science behind it, but when I showed this to a conference, everyone got so excited, I actually had to go and present all this stuff to retailers along with Pablo, the guy who did that review. And so this was very exciting revelation, and I've obviously left the salmon world now, so I won't be part of the studies to look at this, or if I am, it'll just be on an advisory basis. But those of you who met Sonia, Spanish woman who was here for the aquaculture conference and came and visited me on campus, she's going to take this forward. So the question with these algae, artificial algae things was, you know, the secondary effects. Again, the farmers are doing this, another sea lice related reason, but not for positive welfare. But, you know, what's going on here? Are they doing that for understanding, orientation? Is it just to get closer to more cleaner fish? Are they wanting shelter? Or is it the exploring phenotype? Now that's a whole nother talk again as well, sort of fish personality. I'm just starting to develop a proposal with Keller on that, because he's worked on it before, I've worked on it before, so it makes sense. It's just I like to apply it to aquaculture, but it's possible that it's a particular behavioural phenotype that are going through that tunnel and the rest aren't. Another area that needs some research. So do these pass the test? We know that they spend a lot of time doing it, seen that they'll work for the opportunity to do it, but the other areas do need some research. Well, so what? I mean, I've been talking about salmon all the time. We're in the tropics. There's no salmon for miles unless you count the threadfin. What does this all mean? So, and the reason I wanted to talk about it is because environmental enrichment is actually in my research plan, but it's the one that says to be confirmed beside it, because I haven't, I've been talking about the other areas and developing project concepts, but this one I'm still thinking about. So anyone got any bright ideas, please let me know. But look, in Pablo's review, he did highlight some work that had been done in ponds. In this particular case, these are all sort of omnivorous or herbivorous species, and they put these sticks in the ponds which produce this food that can be grazed. But you can see the benefits that were found for the fish with the science: growth, survival, health, better production. And I wanted to touch on this one too. I don't even know if it really is positive welfare, because at least as Pablo classified it, dietary enrichment means how you shape the pellets, how you deliver the food, those sorts of things. But I would argue that this is also dietary enrichment. So Ciro discovered this compound within sort of brackish water areas, mangrove swamps, and found a way to brew it up. And it gives wonderful results in shrimp production and prawn production. They grow faster, they convert better, they've got better immune responses. So it just works really well. And it was licensed to Ridley, which is part of a previous life of mine. And this was the original pond down in Queensland that they were producing it in. And it was this muddy stuff, that's your Novak. And so it is something that's come from the natural environment. Just like I showed you in that diagram, they've actually found a molecule or a compound to go in. Now they've really expanded. These aren't shrimp ponds, these are Novak production ponds in Thailand. That's where Ridley produces most of its Novak now and sells it out to other feed companies. So that's just another potential area in the tropics. But I'm interested in, do aquaculture ponds already provide any environmental enrichment? So this is our friends down the road at Humpty Doo, Barramundi. It's one of their ponds. Now what I see here is there's some vegetation hanging over that may be of interest to the fish, possibly not, because it doesn't hang very far over. But these buoys may be things that they play with or graze on. And then there's the aerators. They may like them, they may hate them. I'm sure they're noisy, but I've got some, in fact, I think I sent Steve the concept note a day or two ago of what I'm thinking about in terms of a way to actually get to understand whether the fish like this stuff or not. But irrespective of that, that's just how they do it on that farm. Here's a contrast. This is a shrimp farm in Vietnam. There's a whole area around a place called Can Mau where they actually have mangroves in the farm. So they're farming the shrimp and the mangroves together. I'm sure there's lots of positive welfare associated with that sort of thing. But again, probably not practical for the industrial version here in Australia. But there are some other, but with this you have shade potentially. You've got leaves dropping in. They may be a positive stimulus for the fish. But in terms of what you do in industrial ponds, there's another area that I'm interested in, And as we're all endotherms, and as endotherms, we often, I think, quite arrogantly forget about how important temperature is to ectotherms. So much so that we actually think that we have a optimal temperature at which we should grow our fish. So behavioral fever is an interesting phenomenon that you probably haven't heard about. And by the way, that's supposed to be pink because that shows the optimal temperature for zebrafish, 28 degrees. So an experiment was done at Stirling University where there was 2 groups of fish, 4 groups of fish. There was fish that were confined at 28 degrees, the optimum temperature, and fish that could wander around between temperature chambers of different temperatures. There were some that were just injected with saline, and others that were injected with a simulated pathogen. And so what you see here is the movement where the fish were located. And what you see is that amongst the simulated pathogen injected fish, they were spending a lot more time in the higher temperature. So they're giving themselves a fever. They weren't just going there and sitting there though, they were going back and forth and giving themselves that fever. So there's a preference for higher temperatures in the zebrafish following the simulated infection. And when this was done as a proper disease challenge with viruses, you saw this come to life with skin hemorrhaging occurring in the fish that were confined at the optimal temperature, and some mortalities, whereas there was none of that where the fish had control. And there was also some genomics work done, and they were able to see that behavioral fever caused a coordinated upregulation of the antiviral genes for the fish held at that wasn't seen in the fish held at a fixed temperature. So the fish are able to control their immune system if they have the possibility to do that. And obviously, if we confine them, that's not on the cards. So, I wonder to myself, how could we offer that in tropical ponds? It's been demonstrated in fish that are grown in ponds. And the only thing I can think of is having a shallower area. I guess you could also have a greenhouse kind of effect, but a shallower area which the fish can access would give an access to a higher temperature. And if it had a gradient, they could choose a gradient. But something like that I'm thinking of as a future experiment, both in the lab and in the farm. And then finally, I just wanted there's a question about how do we assess positive welfare on farm? And there's quite a bit of work being done in ruminants and terrestrial animals, including by a previous co-author of mine. And the themes that came out for me were that could be applied in the case of fish were QBA, which is a way that we assess what's good, what feels good and what feels bad for animals nowadays. It's a sort of test that's been developed and become quite fashionable. Skin care and condition, synchronicity of feeding. Now, in a fish farm, that's kind of a given in terms of what's measurable most of the time, but synchronicity of behaviors is another area that I think could be a good indicator, and play, which may be a little difficult to measure in a murky pond. So that brings me to the end. I'll come back to a salmon photo just because it was worth showing to you. That's somewhere cold and dark in winter. So up to now, we've focused on removing negative welfare in farms. But consumers and retailers are increasingly interested in positive welfare. We're seeing it coming up a lot. And the retailers have always been great at pointing out what's coming, behind the scenes, talking to scientists and talking to industry. They tend to have a good idea of what's coming our way as a society. Positive welfare, environmental enrichment are possible intensive aquaculture because, as I've shown to you, that the industry is probably already doing it to some extent, just for other reasons. It's secondary. It doesn't necessarily need to add costs or equipment if it's things they're already doing. There's lots more research to do. It's possible. I'm very much into on-farm research complemented with labs, and it's possible to study and assess in commercial environments. And it's a potential way to deliver on some of the much more challenging aspects of the current welfare frameworks, the feelings-based stuff. And finally, I just thought I'd show you where the lake I used to look across before I came to live in Darwin. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sunil. Does anybody have?
Shall I take? I can. Oh, I can't see mine. Can I?
I just had a question about whether or not there are any national or international certification programs for positive welfare of aquaculture, producing fish. There's sustainably caught wild fish, there's free-range chickens, there's grass-fed beef. Are we not there yet, or does that exist? I don't know.
So the question was just whether there's any certification for positive welfare, and the answer is, in Europe at least, when it comes to terrestrial animals, there's actually regulations around providing toys for pigs, that sort of thing. So positive welfare is fairly firmly implanted in some terrestrial systems. With fish, no. I'm on a couple of the committees for certification, and we've talked a lot about positive welfare, and we see it as something that we've set it down as something farmers should be aspiring to, but we haven't got the science, and without the science, we can't make those demands of the industry. But it's something they need to be aware of, and it's coming. I mean, I first did a very early version of this talk in 2019 to the Norwegian salmon industry, the great and the good, and they were actually very surprised. I mean, probably no one had ever spoken to them about emotions in fishes, but they were very, very open to discussing it and interested. Yeah.
Much kinder to fish. How much work has been done on the translation of positive enrichment to increased production? I guess it's all about the trade-off between positive enrichment versus just production.
So the question is whether about the economic benefits mostly from production versus ethical benefits. So again, we're a bit early, but I've shown you some examples where there's been measures taken in farms to maintain health or to improve production, improve, the elevens, the eggs, for example, and the sea lice examples, where, I mean, it's directly positive welfare when it comes to the elevens on the mat, the eggs and elevens on the mats. But in the case of the sea lice measures, those are secondary effects. But no, again, it's too early for that to be known for commercial farms, but there's been a lot of great studies showing in the lab or in study environments, some of them semi-commercial, that you get positive benefits. It's just that when you take it out into the field, there's so much more variability. It's always difficult to get the proof. Rick.
One sector of the aquaculture industry is aquarium, and it's a very huge, very valuable industry. Also one in so many ways provides rich opportunities. Is there much interest in that sector?
The question was about positive welfare in the aquaria industry. Yeah, I mean, obviously the aquaria industry is huge, and I think you can go onto YouTube and look up bubble play in aquaria, and there's just lots and lots and lots of videos of fish apparently playing in bubbles. But yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's not really considered, it's not very heavily regulated, as you know, Rick, the aquarium industry. So it's been responsible for bringing diseases across borders. And yeah, and fish welfare wise, I mean, it can be atrocious. But, you know, there's a lot of, amongst the good aquarists, they actually look into the biology of the fish and they provide that kind of stuff. So the good aquarists probably lead the way. In fact, I've been working with a company in Norway that want to provide the sort of perfect welfare. They've got a lot of money to set up a farm with perfect welfare. And we're having this workshop and we're discussing fish art. You know, what are we going to hang on the walls of the tank? But yeah, aquarists, there's good and bad, but the good is really good. Yeah, and I mean, it's not just the physical stuff, also the social part, you know, which communities of fish you're putting together. That's really important for positive welfare.
This might be a little bit rhetorical because it's so early in the game, but obviously I just moved from Tasmania where the salmon farming is very, very controversial for a lot of environmental reasons. Is there opportunity to have co-benefits environmentally and from a welfare perspective?
So the question is whether there's combined benefits of welfare and environment. And the answer is yes, in the case of, for example, self-feeding. I mean, in the 90s, I was in a startup and we developed a system that was in Tasmania, actually, that was the first to feed fish autonomously by demand. So you got maximum growth and minimum waste. So that was reducing waste. The systems all grew too big for that later. So that's no longer used, and companies like Blue Grove and a couple of others are trying to develop a new version of that. So there is that. They don't have sea lice in Tasmania, so there's none of the things I showed you, no kelp curtains, or they probably do some oxygenation in places. But welfare, in principle, keeping your fish healthy and feeding them optimally will have environmental benefits.
Really interesting thought. More of a philosophical for you. So obviously, sort of people's ability to recognize that fish are intelligent, you know, probably underestimates the fact that things like facial expression, I think people probably have an easier time recognizing the charismatic big animals, things like whale sharks, things like that, are sort of more intelligent. Would feel worse, for example, that, you know, negative effects on an animal that compared to a goldfish or something. Do you reckon there's any relationship between the fish's body size and its ability or capacity to perceive its environment, for example? And how easy we put in an exact application that you give 200 rainbow fish, not that's an whole. Whether you try to do that to an animal or something.
So the question is whether there might be any relationship between the size of the fish and its ability to its level of sentience, I guess. And the answer is no, I don't think there is. So fish are much more interesting and varied than mammals. You know, mammals are kind of pretty much all the same in terms of reproductive system and things, whereas fish, you know, there's a lot more of them and the variations are huge. And so you get some fish where the bigger fish, they when they get big enough, they get good enough to turn into a female. Barramundi, for example, they all start off male and they turn female. So, but no, because zebrafish, you know, they're tiny. And there's a lot of work done on them because they've got a short life cycle and there's a lot going on there. Those cleaner wrasse I showed you, really smart. and they're tiny little fish. The bigger fish may perhaps have a smaller brain size for their whole body. So if anything, it might go the other way. But good question. The thing I like about WIFA, it's so interdisciplinary. You know, I've worked with philosophers, sociologists, psychologists, economists, as well as all kinds of biologists in this field.
Maybe a follow-up question about, is there some sort of phylogenetic relationship? So detected birds, right? It claims that particularly smart. Any sense of that in fish?
Yeah, well, that comes on to that whole talk about personality, Alan. So I'll quickly give you a quick summation. So within sibling fish, so, you know, a brood from a single female male, you get hundreds or tens, depending on the fish species, of siblings. And you can look at those for personality, as you can with a lot of animal families. And we tend to look, the kind of easiest one to tease out is the bold-shy continuum. And the bold ones are the ones that tend to get selected for aquaculture. This is what me and Keller are working on just now as a concept. They tend to get chosen for aquaculture because they cope better in a homogeneous environment. They grow really fast and they're aggressive. And they're usually a bit dumb. You know, they're not as smart. You know, they won't cope with change very well. Whereas the shy ones are explorers, and they are ready for things to change because they have to make the most of the stuff on the sides that the boldfish aren't picking up. And so they're better. They do better in learning tests and things. So yeah, you can pick attributes.
Whole family, so orcas are smart family.
Oh, I see. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, I picked some examples of fish, you know, at the cleaner wrasse. Obviously, they can't all do what the cleaner wrasse do. They're all, you know, evolved for their environments and what they need. So, yeah, some are smarter than others, but there's so much that we still have to explore there. I mean, we know that salmon can find their way through a maze. They, you know, they navigate a very long way. They have some quite complex social interactions when they're territorial, when they're younger. But we don't really know much about what happens out at sea because they're just kind of out there and they're hard to study. The only thing we know is what's been studied in fish farms. So all of the ecological knowledge on adult salmon is done has come from fish farming environments originally, including my PhD thesis that was done there.
We're running a bit low on time. I'm going to just see if there are any questions.
How do I do that? Oh, yeah. Good idea.
We can pick this up outside.
All right. Good. Let's pick up my Can I just take it out, or do you? I always do it, and it's never caused a problem before. Oh, I'm glad you are. All right.